Good evening, everyone. I'm gonna begin in a moment. I'm gonna wait until we get a few more people. We had a couple hundred signed up. I see people clicking in. I'm just gonna wait a minute or two before I get going. I am Chris Hamilton. I'm the founder of Hamilton Education. I'm gonna be talking about college admissions and about some curious and even challenging trends and how to handle some of what's coming down the line here. Again, I'm going to wait a minute or two as we get more people to join us. All right. Good evening, everyone. Again, I'm going to wait a minute or two. I still see people joining us. I don't want to start off without a solid quorum. I am talking tonight about a fairly sensitive topic. It took me a little bit of thinking to kind of screw up the courage, to borrow some Shakespeare, to talk about some things that are not easy to talk about, which is issues of admission and identity and even race and how they're affecting students that I see in the last few years. So I'm calling this webinar, Why Almost Everything You Knew About College Admissions is No Longer True and What You Can Do About It. And I mean, of course, in the last couple of years, people have been truly shocked to see certain admissions results. In fact, let's start with that. I want to ask you to participate in a little quiz. Which one of these two students got into UC San Diego this year? So I want you to consider. The first one has a GPA of 4.47 and an SAT of 1590. This person is an ISEF second grand award. ISEF is the International Science and Engineering Fair. To win second means you're one of 2 or 3 people in the world who, in her case, won an award for a computer science project. She wanted to improve an industry algorithm, and she did. She's also USICO. This is a computer science award, silver award, AME qualifier. She's also internationally successful in piano. A Women in STEM Foundation awarded this young woman a special prize they call the Impact Award. She also, at the beginning of COVID, started a nonprofit that has taught students online who would suffer from learning loss. This young woman, for free, has built really an entire company that does free tutoring, not only in academic subjects, but origami, learning how to play ukulele. And student number 2 has a GPA of 4.1. This person did not take an SAT. This person did come into my office and take a PSAT. Her score was a 780. That's not really a good score. This student had no activities to speak of. And as you could probably guess from just the logic of this question, the student who got into UC San Diego is student number 2. Student number 1 this year, don't cry for her. She got into MIT, some other very good schools. UC Riverside accepted student number 1 though, but not for her first choice major, computer science. They accepted her for her second choice major. Here's another quiz. In 2016, 119 Westview High School students were admitted to Berkeley. I'm sorry, they applied to Berkeley. 44% were admitted. What was the 2021 acceptance rate? And again, if you see where this is going, you can probably guess. 5 years later, the acceptance rate to Berkeley for Westview students was not cut in half. It was not cut by a third or to a third. It was 6.7%. Westview students got in less than a sixth of the time. I'm just going to quickly check here. Someone says they can't hear anything. Hopefully that's not the case. All right, I have trouble accounting for my screen here. There we go. So in other words, I want to be asking what accounts for Westview's acceptance rate being cut to less than 1/6 of what it was a few years ago? What accounts for an MIT accepted student being rejected by so many UCs? Why are perfect students now being rejected, in some cases by nearly all the UCs? To understand the situation, we need to understand a little bit of history. The 1960s introduced what was then called the UC Master Plan. The Master Plan meant that the UCs would be part of a 3-tiered university system. At the very top, we would have the University of California. Berkeley was the first, and UCLA came next. These were meant to be what were called R1 universities. These are very stringent admission standards, although when we go back to 1960, the admission standard for Berkeley was you had to have a 3.0 average to be admitted. These are universities that are meant to compete with Ivy Leagues. These are universities that are focusing on research and are meant to produce intellectual property, fame, glory. This is why when you look at a periodic table, you will see elements named Berkelium and Californium. There are no elements named Harvardium or Princetonium. The UC Master Plan resulted in truly world-class universities. The Cal State colleges were meant to collect a slightly less rigorous group of students. They were meant to focus a little less on research, but be more, we might say, inclusive. And the community colleges were meant to produce almost no barriers whatsoever. You didn't really need to meet any meaningful requirements. For many, many decades, you got into the Cal States through a formula of grades and SAT scores. And the UCs, well, we'll talk about it. The UCs in 1996 switched to a more Ivy League style holistic admissions process. It's worth noticing that the UCs have long been understood to have a kind of hierarchy. Berkeley and Los Angeles tend to be at the top. For many years, San Diego, Irvine, Santa Barbara, Davis would be kind of all together. San Diego is kind of almost occupying its own category right now. And Santa Cruz and Riverside, and with the newest one, Merced, it was pretty much understood that you could take a look at the data and know which of these schools would you be likely to get into. So When students applied in 2016, this is the year that Westview students had a 44% acceptance rate. You can actually take a look at this freshman admissions profile and see that 17% are accepted in general to Berkeley. And you can even see that if your GPA is above a 4.0, you're not likely to get in. You're 29.8% likely to get in. But if your GPA is a 3.7 or 3.8 or even a 3.9, it drops precipitously. You're going to be about 5% likely to get in. You can see that if your ACT is very strong, you're, again, about 28, 30% likely to get in. You can see in 2018, it shrinks a little bit. If you're in the top rank, you're more like 25% likely to get in. San Diego, you can see that you might be in 2017, or rather, this is the fall class of 2017. So in 2016, when these people applied, 2/3 of the people with a good GPA got into UC San Diego. What you can't see, because I don't have enough room on my screen, is that you could also see how many APs or honors classes you took in your high school career. That also corresponds to a certain percentage. You can see that San Diego got a little bit harder in 2017 for the freshman class of 2018. You can see that UCLA and Berkeley are really neck and neck. They're about the same difficulty. With this information, families could make reasonable decisions about which UCs were a reach and which ones were targets, which ones were safeties. I would argue it's very meaningful that you're not seeing this transparent admissions data from the UCs any longer. In fact, it's going to be something we talk about tonight. You could sort of make the same assumptions about reaches and targets and safety schools by looking at the US News ranking, which more or less told you that UC Irvine, which is at the bottom here, it's going to be a lot easier to get into than Dartmouth College or Northwestern. Again, you had a sort of reach, target, and safety system for the most part. A woman named Michelle Hernandez in 1997 published a book called A is for Admission. She was a Dartmouth admissions officer. She revealed a lot of the Dartmouth formula. And although Dartmouth isn't exactly the same as Harvard or Yale or Princeton, she revealed that in 1997, if you had really good scores and really good grades and you took hard classes, you were about 90% likely to get into Dartmouth, an Ivy League school. With these metrics, over more than 20 years, I've helped dedicated students get into what for many are their dream colleges. These are the class of 2021, 2022. So they've already graduated. This is just some early acceptances from that year. So you can see Stanford and Bowdoin and Williams and Duke and Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Penn, just about up and down the list. In the past decade, though, these rates of acceptance have been cut in half. They, in fact, have been, for some schools, like Northeastern, cut to less than 1/3 or even 1/4 of what those numbers were. USC was, pretty much cut in half. Since the early 2000s, I've helped literally thousands of kids get admission to Ivy League schools. In 2020, 30% of the students in the counties of Southern California who got into Harvard were our students. But in a moment, we'll talk about why, although I'm proud of that, if you go north of these southernmost counties into Los Angeles and you go to Harvard Westlake, a private school in Los Angeles, Harvard Westlake that same year had 43 students get into Harvard. If you're suspecting that the system is not driven entirely by merit, you indeed are correct. I've long explained for 2 decades that the American system is holistic. It's not driven by a single exam like the SAT or ACT. It's not driven, as it would be in England, by O levels and A levels primarily, or the Chinese Gaokao, or the Iranian concours. There's a number of factors, and we could help people understand what those factors are. But it's gotten a little crazy. In 2020, there was a seismic shift, largely. Well, we'll try to put it in context, but you could see it coming if you looked carefully. The UCs stopped publishing in 2019 this kind of transparent summary of the statistics of who got in. And I'm going to make an argument that I think you may find persuasive about why they stopped in 2019, why they went from a more transparent admissions system to a more opaque one. But first, I got to give you a little history lesson. In 1996, I was teaching English at UCLA. I was a very low-level English instructor. I'd only been there for a year or two. And in 1996, there were two voter propositions that caught my attention as a young humanities teacher. One was Prop 209, which meant to end affirmative action, and the other was Prop 187, which tried to claw back all kinds of rights and privileges from undocumented people in California. I helped organize civil disobedience to protest these propositions. I even went door to door, talking to families before the November vote, explaining why my students at UCLA, if we removed affirmative action, many of them would not find their way onto the UCLA campus. But knocking door to door, occasionally I knocked on some doors and people had questions for me that were a bit awkward. One family who is Vietnamese asked me, 7 of us live in a 2-bedroom apartment. There are points, I understand, for adding diversity. This mom asked me if her children would get these points, under the affirmative action system in place, and I had to tell her honestly, no. And that was a bit awkward. Prop 209 passed, so the side that I wanted to win lost, and affirmative action was ended at the UCs. And as I've tried to suggest, I had some misgivings about whether or not it was really fair to say that one group of immigrants that's had a tough life gets points and another group doesn't. But when Prop 209 passed, there was about a year where the UC struggled to meet what we would call diversity interests. But in the end, the UC's created a program called holistic admissions, where they look at many, many different factors. This is very much like how an Ivy League would look at students. So awkwardly, when I came to San Diego in 2006, there were still some counselors who were telling people, oh, the UCs aren't looking at essays, they're just looking at scores and grades. And that was true at one point in time, but by 2006, that was no longer true. And those are, in some ways, the golden years. We had so many students simply telling their true stories of who they were and what they had accomplished. And it's worth noting, before 2020, the UCs and Cal States, if you look at what are the 15 most diverse public universities in the United States, the UCs and Cal States are 2/3 of them. So there were worries by some that the end of affirmative action would kill diversity in the UCs. Some people even made the argument that it was dead diversity, but by almost every measure, that's not the case. The UCs and Cal States became kind of crown jewels of both diversity and excellence. I had students who would get into Berkeley, sometimes with if I met them kind of late in the process, didn't have a chance to work with them for SAT, they would have not very good scores, but they had a great story and they had good grades. And anyway, I kind of have a fondness for those times. You need to know that in the last 10 years, an ideological framework that's commonly called diversity, equity, and inclusion has changed the way most colleges think about students and the way they think about acceptance. At a glance, I admit it's pretty hard to fault these three words, diversity, equity, inclusion. Diversity adds a lot to a campus experience. You do not want kids who all have the same background and all have the same assumptions. It's much better to have a diverse group of students seeing how other people live and learn and feel and think. And equity, I would have explained years ago in a UCLA classroom, is largely the idea that when we say equality, we sometimes unfairly assume that everyone has equal chances and starts at the same point in life. Equity, in many ways, is meant to remind us that that's often not the case. When universities use the word inclusion, if we want to give a very gracious, generous definition, we would simply say it's a reminder that we might be unconsciously excluding people in ways we don't mean to. So in my own office, we do casual, informal trainings where I remind my staff that if a woman is wearing a head covering, a hijab, you probably don't want to offer to shake her hand if you're a male. She likely would find that intrusive and uncomfortable. And I remind staff when we're ordering pizza for review sessions, it's not just that some students prefer a cheese pizza, it's that some students are vegetarians and they can't eat a pepperoni pizza. Some students have religious prohibitions against eating pork. So I don't want to sound like I'm skeptical of the concepts of diversity or that equity doesn't have meaning or that inclusion isn't a meaningful value. But as they're practiced on campuses today, equity essentially means not too many of one ethnic group and not too few of another, which again, is certainly a reasonable goal. But when it comes to selective colleges and selective majors, we call selective majors impacted majors usually. College administrators began insisting that there was an equity problem, that there were too few Hispanic, Native American, African American students in some colleges and some majors, and too many Middle Eastern and Asian American students. So when you hear this phrase DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion, it's really come to mean too many of one group and too few of another's. And the problem for the UCs was, if you see the world this way, that there's just too many Asian students, Prop 209 makes it literally illegal to admit students based on their gender or ethnicity, whereas equity demands that you do exactly that you admit people largely based on categories of identity. So starting in 2018, the UCs did two crucial things. They initiated a 2-year study of the SAT and ACT. They wanted to find out, is the SAT useful? Does it predict something meaningful? Does it predict success in UCs? Or as critics have said, would grades be a better mechanism? And they began advocating, well, they also wanted to know, is it racist or is it fair? And should they keep it or get rid of it? The UCs also began advocating for another voter proposition called Prop 16 that was an effort to reverse Proposition 209. And that's almost certainly why they stopped offering transparent advice about who gets in to what UCs. Neither one of these efforts worked as planned for the UCs. The task force, some of you have seen me hold this up. The task force that investigated the SAT and ACT concluded, this will shock some of you, that the SAT and ACT are actually far better predictors than grades. they speculated that grades go up and down depending on the rigor of your school district and the rigor of your teachers. And they remarked, you can almost read the note of surprise, that the SAT and ACT are probably the most objective measures we could find. They're in fact almost the opposite of being racist or sexist. MIT quoted the UC study in defending their decision to go back to requiring the SAT and ACT. Purdue did the same thing. The task force also recommended, as you can see here, that the UCs not make testing optional. They have pragmatic concerns about how campuses would evaluate and compare applicants. That's a bureaucratese way of saying, how in the world are you going to take 50,000 kids with perfect grades and have 6,000 walk through the gates as first years at UCLA? It's meaningful that the UC Regents got this study and essentially threw it in the trash. It didn't fit with their ideological assumptions about the world, so they ignored it. The internal study on the SAT and ACT did not find that the SAT was weakening diversity. In fact, as you've just seen, the UCs could brag that they were among the best and among the most diverse universities in the entire United States. The UCs, of course, had a different ideological goal. They decided to not accept the SAT and ACT. They did this largely by kind of sneaking it in through the COVID problem. I had no surprise that SAT and ACT would be optional during COVID because it was very difficult to take these tests. The UCs simply made that basically a sort of permanent decision. The UCs also were surprised to discover that Prop 16, which was meant to call back or erase Prop 209, the end of affirmative action, California voters, the most liberal in the 50 states, still decided that they didn't want their students to be judged primarily by race, but by almost every other factor. And so the UCs were kind of stuck because they knew what they wanted. They wanted to change the population of the UCs, to have more of certain underrepresented students, which again, I would say part of me would say is a very noble effort. But to do that, they had to build a system where they would have fewer of the students who are supposedly overrepresented. And those students are middle class students who go to competitive public high schools. They are overrepresented in the language of the UCs and DEI. And so that explains largely why the UCs chose what we might call proxies for race and ethnicity. They chose being middle class. They chose to purposely take fewer students from very top performing universities. We'll talk a little bit about the repercussions of that decision. They know that universities like UCLA and Berkeley, if they take a lot of Westview students or Torrey Pines or CCA students, they're going to get more Asian American or Middle Eastern students, and they want fewer of them. It's probably worth pausing and asking, aren't the UCs just trying to make things more fair? In fact, that's almost exactly how they would frame it. I want to make sure you at least consider for a moment what we might call fairness and what universities think of in terms of equity. They don't perfectly overlap. What fairness is a matter of debate, but in a university, equity is pretty simple. It means you want numbers that match up with background populations. You don't want one group having too many and one group having too few. The explanation on a college campus for why there is one group that's overrepresented is very simple. The explanation is almost always there must be systemic, basically a kind of structural racism to explain it. I want you to think about that argument though, because this is a student at a protest defending diversity. And when you look at this sign, "My race is my story," it seems perfectly reasonable to me to imagine that indeed your ethnicity, your race, your background is a part of who you are. But it's implied essentially that maybe for other people, their race is not their story. I'm glad that this young woman feels that her race is her story, but you do have to ask, what about people of other races? I would agree that race indeed matters. Older generations are more inclined to talk about being colorblind, to not see color. I think people in my generation would be a little skeptical of that. If race matters, though, we need to think about, well, how does it matter exactly in college admissions, and how should it matter? This is a question that the Supreme Court will be considering presently. I'm skeptical of the argument that the only explanation for a preponderance of Asian Americans or Middle Eastern families doing well in school is structural racism somehow in their favor. One person who believes that story, or at least used to believe it, is the former San Diego superintendent. She said a while back, we have an influx of Asians from China, and the people who are able to make that journey are wealthy. A large influx of Chinese families moving in, sight unseen, into our homes, into the community, and that requires money. I think it's probably worth remembering that until 1965, it was illegal for Asians of every description to immigrate to the United States because Asians were considered racially undesirable. The federal law that prevented immigration for Asians was a vestige of a late 19th century California law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. That is pretty much what it sounds like, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Many Chinese and Indian immigrants in the 1970s and 80s arrived in the United States with about $40. That's largely because of currency restrictions. Many Vietnamese immigrants arrived in the 1970s with almost nothing except the clothes on their backs. Today in 2023, I have worked in a pro bono fashion with refugees from Syria and Iraq. They arrive often with nothing but their lives, and some lost those. And yet all of those groups are considered overrepresented by the UCs and most other universities. According to DEI, these groups are overrepresented. They must be privileged. In many ways, university administrators and admissions readers don't really care about individuals, but numbers on a chart. And I think that explains this thinking from this superintendent. By the way, a student at CCA organized a petition through change.org to complain about this, and that was directly related to why this person is no longer representing you if you're in the San Diego Union District. I'm very proud of that young woman. I think there's room for debate, but the superintendent's arguments fly in the face of actual facts. The UCs did a study a while back asking, could we use poverty or a lack of funds as a stand-in for affirmative action? And the problem they encountered was, if they looked at poverty, they still had too many Asian students. I would argue, I admit there's room for debate, that it's largely cultural issues, traditions of civil service exams, education and learning as ladders to progress from some immigrant groups that are not as present in other immigrant groups. I have met almost no one who's educated who would argue that there's something inherently lacking in any particular group of people, but there are differences in cultural inheritances and in priorities. One academic theory explains that Asian Americans are successful because they are, the term they use is white adjacent, or they're culturally white, a claim that I think would surprise many Asian Americans who practice Islam or whose grandparents were interned during World War II in places like Manzanar, or the young woman who just last year was stabbed on a college bus for, quote, literally being Asian. I think it would surprise this sense of privilege. Vincent Chin's family, who in 1982 was beaten to death because in Detroit, unhappy auto workers thought he was Japanese. He, of course, was Chinese. There has been an extraordinary, more than 300% rise in Asian hate and anti-Asian violence. I would argue the UCs should look in the mirror before they offer an opinion about some of these trends. There are well-regarded books. These are two that I highly recommend. On the left, The Chosen is by a Berkeley sociology professor, Jerome Karabel. On the right, a little more readable, fast-paced book that tells the history of essentially Ivy League admissions. And they will both agree, Ivy League admissions are strikingly representative of racial theories in the 20th century. Nearly every Ivy League president in 1920 to about 1960 was what we would today call a eugenicist, what were called eugenicists back then. Of course, people that believe in the racial superiority of some groups. In the 1950s and 1960s, the overrepresented group that universities were worried about was not Asian Americans, because we would not let them into the country. It was a different group. It was a group that were commonly called Eastern European, which was a polite way of saying these people were Jewish. The Ivies developed holistic admission. They developed a process to look at more than numbers and scores, precisely because their problem was they had too many of a certain immigrant group, and those too many people were Jewish students. So I want to draw your attention to this slide. It says, I had lunch, blah, 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 sometime between 1930 and 1932, and they're talking about why are there no African-American students at Princeton? And the official answer was apparently, I don't know, they just don't want to come. I'm going to read this next one in its entirety. I asked how many Jews there were in Princeton. Mr. Hibben said about 200. I said, how many were there last year? He said, about 200. I asked how many there were the year before, and he said, about 200. I said that was very odd and asked how it happened. He said he didn't know, it just happened. Mrs. Hibben was outraged and said, Jack Hibben, I don't see how you can sit there and lie to this young man. You know very well that you and Dean Eisenhart get together every year and fix the quota. Caitlin Flanagan is not a right-wing pundit. She's a left-leaning journalist, and in a very important piece in The Atlantic, she talks about some of the things that I'm sharing with you now, that the University of California is essentially lying to us. The abandonment of standardized testing is a nearly transparent effort to admit by race, where it's legally forbidden in 2 voter propositions. If you're wondering why you would doubt what the UCs tell you, or even why you would doubt what some Ivy League schools tell you when they talk about test optional, I want you to consider this question that I asked the University of Irvine chatbot. I said, which majors at UC Irvine are impacted? And this is the answer. Good news. UC Irvine does not have any impacted majors. Nursing, computer science, and business administration are the most highly selected majors. And then they give us this non sequitur. The average freshman retention rate, an indicator of student satisfaction, is 93%. Highly selected majors at UC Irvine are capped majors. They are impacted majors. They've just chosen to not use that word. It is not good news. A word that you should have in your mind is disingenuous. This is a pretty fancy, polite way of saying not the truth. You are lying. You are not being honest. Speaking of not being honest, there is another reason why the UCs and many Ivies have either been, on the case of the UCs, test blind, or for Ivies, test optional. It has to do with, it has to do with some numbers that are on the US News chart. In a conversation with an Ivy League admissions director in 2020, I asked about test optional at his university, and he said, there are 3 reasons why we're going to go test optional. The first, he said, was we don't think students are going to find it easy to take the SAT and ACT in the midst of COVID. Of course, that is very reasonable. It turned out to be correct. He also said, we think it's not quite right that kids maybe living on an Indian reservation in Wyoming or in a housing project in Chicago who can't really get access to these tests wouldn't even be considered. I'm very sympathetic to that point. But then he said, quite frankly, if we go test optional, we'll get 20 to 30,000 more applications than we would have. And that means that we will be rejecting 20 to 30,000 more applicants. That means we will be more selective if we are test optional. Ironically, removing a testing requirement will make the university appear better by the metrics of US News. And tellingly, he said, if we don't go test optional, not only will we be criticized, our rival schools will get 20 or 30,000 extra applications and reject 20 or 30,000 extra students and be more selective, and they will go up and we will go down in the rankings. The UCs, they got a 2-for-1. They get to fulfill an ideological goal that they have, which is more of certain students. UCLA's chancellor in an alumni meeting last week said the goal is by 2025 to have 30% Hispanic and African-American students, which again, if you do that by creating better pathways, stronger programs in schools, that sounds great. But his pathway is accepting fewer students who are Asian American or Middle Eastern. The Ivy League director told me bluntly, he asked me not to identify him, so I'm not going to. He said, frankly, if you are white, if you are Asian, if you go to a competitive school, these tests are not optional. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. If you are wondering if admitting less qualified students to the UCs would harm the reputation of the UC campuses, maybe, perhaps. Just a few years ago, UC San Diego offered no pre-calculus classes for STEM majors. A math professor just a few weeks ago told me, after a long sigh, that he has to put together classes to serve 300 students in STEM majors this year at UC San Diego who have not had pre-calculus. And he says next year he's going to have to accommodate 900 students in STEM majors who have never seen trig or any pre-calculus. Again, from one point of view, we are being inclusive. We are opening up a pathway for students who have been in some sense underserved and are underrepresented. Viewed from another angle, there are 900 students who are abundantly qualified to be engineers or scientists who will not be at UC San Diego. The UCs are seriously proposing eliminating freshman grades. These two observations strongly suggest that the UCs are not building as qualified a class as they have. But if the question is, will it harm the reputation? The metrics used by US News have almost nothing to do with what we might call outputs, how successful students are later. It's mostly about inputs. It's mostly about how many apply and how many do you reject, how popular you are. If it was prom, it would be how many people asked you to prom and how many did you say no to, which is a strange measure of popularity, but that's how colleges see themselves, frankly. The UCs are talking about creating the most qualified first-year classes ever, but again, they're not even honest when you ask them what majors are impacted. If UC Irvine was honest, they would probably get fewer applicants for these majors, and then the programs would become not as selective. Why do you need to be more selective when you're already rejecting the vast majority? A word that's used often on campuses is equity, but it seems to be in their mouths, but not in their hearts or on their minds, because if the UCs told the truth, these majors have a 3% acceptance rate, they'd get fewer applicants and the programs would be less renowned. By the way, the term of art for encouraging more students who almost certainly haven't had the preparation to apply, so you can reject more of them. Universities would describe that with the phrase inclusiveness. It's probably worth noting that among many cultural ironies, Ivy Leagues, if you are lucky enough to be attending in your first week, you'll have to undergo an orientation where you're expected to understand the principles of inclusiveness. But the letter you got telling you that you're accepted will eventually reveal that they excluded 97% of the applicants. And the goal of every Ivy is to exclude 98% in the year to come. I am, as you can tell, a bit skeptical about some of the behaviors and patterns of prestigious universities, largely because I was employed by one. I helped unionize graduate student instructors at UCLA, about 14,000 of them, a group of 14 of us, basically. I saw UCLA spend millions of dollars on lawyers to make sure that graduate students didn't have eye care and dental plans. UCLA is a beautiful campus and there are wonderful professors there, but UCLA offered a job posting last year for PhDs in a STEM field. The pay was $0. I helped organize a union at UCLA because the hiring practices, the HR principles in the UC, especially at UCLA, were nearly indistinguishable from Walmart, which is make everybody a part-time employee and offer them almost nothing in terms of healthcare or benefits. Soft metrics is a phrase used to describe admitting students without scores through other mechanisms, essays, interviews, extracurriculars. Stanford's own study on soft metrics, what if we get rid of testing, confirmed what common sense would probably tell most of you, that wealthier students will be more advantaged if you don't look at the numbers. Instead, you look at their experiences and how well they put together a story. I used to work with 800 people for test prep that were all middle class. In shifting to more of a college consulting model, I'm now working with wealthier students around the world. I liked it the other way, but this is how Stanford wants it. I'm going to encourage you to consider Stanford's commitment to equity is the very least problematic, if not outright hypocritical. In an interview with Malcolm Gladwell, the then president of Stanford, when Malcolm Gladwell asked him, if I had $100 million, should I give it to Stanford or should I give it to a community college that serves underrepresented students? You can guess what the president of Stanford said in response to that question. He said, give it to us. We would know what to do with it more than some community college. Stanford already at that moment had $40 billion in their endowment. For a moment, I'd like you to consider these soft metrics where we're using mechanisms to not see how strong you are in math or reading, but to peer into your soul. There's reason to be skeptical of whether universities are making the best decisions. These are two hugely famous Stanford grads. One is headed to prison. The other will likely be headed to prison. Both committed fraud on a grand scale. So again, I would even say it's important to keep in mind, if you want to get into a very fancy school that's not a public school, there have traditionally been, for the last 70 years, two doors you can walk through. One that we could call aristocratic and one that we could call meritocratic. 50% of Harvard or Yale or Stanford will come through the aristocratic door. Feeder schools like Harvard Westlake or Phillips Exeter Academy, donors, legacy, advantages that my students don't have. And when it comes to athletics, there will be some students that come from challenging backgrounds who play football and basketball, but a lot of the athletic recruitment at a really fancy school are sports like, lacrosse or field hockey or sailing. How's Westview's sailing team doing during this year? It's important to recognize that the acceptance rate for the half that goes through the aristocratic door is 20 to 60%. If you're a legacy, it's around 20% for many of these colleges. If you're a donor, it's closer to 60%. If you're an athlete, it's closer to 60%. So when you see an acceptance rate that says 3.8% for some of these schools, I want you to consider half of the people making that average of 3.8, half got in at a rate of 20 to 60%. The other half, my half, probably a good estimate would be about 1.5%. It's pretty simple math. There are people who have criticized what's commonly called meritocracy. These are two books by two thinkers and philosophers. One, I just noticed, one of these guys is saying that the other guy is making a bold and brave critique. I bet if we look on the back of Michael Sandel's book, Daniel Markovits thinks he's pretty great too. There's a phrase, Nepo baby, but anyway. I am sympathetic to some of the criticisms of vicious meritocracy. I don't like that students are stressed, but I would suggest, how can you not be stressed when you could do everything perfectly and still not get into the most modest of your state universities? Last year, I had a student who got into, thank goodness, Stanford, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT. I only let him apply to so many after he got into Stanford, but he was rejected by almost all of the UCs and every Cal State he applied to. So I would say, in thinking about meritocracy and some of its challenges, it's really now a system in Ivy Leagues where there's an aristocratic door, and there has been no effort whatsoever, not even a conversation, to change the pathway of donor or legacy or feeder schools, boarding schools, Sidwell Friends in Washington, D.C. But this group, this aristocratic half, has decided to take the moral high ground that instead of a meritocratic system of admission, there's going to be an equity-driven system to make up for historical, what they're perceiving to be historical inequities. The squeeze on the middle class and on Asian American and Middle Eastern students, it might, be a bitter pill to swallow, but it is made worse by the fact that the UCs and Cal States have also shifted to this model. So I'm just suggesting there has to be one door that will admit very hardworking students who don't fit either one of these models. Again, in the past, it was this meritocratic door. I help people understand how to talk to this aristocratic half, but it is certainly getting harder and harder. This student that I'm telling you of who was accepted to Stanford early and then Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, and not accepted to Davis or Santa Barbara or Irvine, rejected by Cal Poly SLO, San Jose State. I've had some people tell me, Mr. Hamilton, you're such a naive old man. There's this thing called yield protection. Clearly Irvine thought he was too good, too desirable. Okay, explain then why this young man didn't get into Berkeley or UCLA. Who in the world is so good at computer science that Berkeley says, we have nothing to teach you, you're just too good? I saw last year people who won grand award, first place, ISEF, again, accepted to MIT and Stanford, rejected by many of the UCs. If there is nothing you can do to get in, and I'm not saying there's nothing, but if there's nothing some students can do, you probably need to be asking some questions of the UC regents. I hope most people would acknowledge if you don't get into the UCs, for most people, Stanford or MIT, they are not your backup school. Okay, that's the history of what's going on. That's the bleak reality. And I wanna now talk about what you can do about this. And I'm open to having people argue with me and tell me why my point of view isn't right. I will happily hear any of those arguments, but I do want to talk. My computer seems to be a little frozen. All right, I'm just going to wait a little bit. There we go. I want to talk about these new realities. The first duty is to be clear-eyed. You have to acknowledge them. You cannot imagine that what was true 5 years ago for an older child is true now. You cannot look at the UCs and say, well, certainly we'll get into Irvine or Davis because I have fantastic scores and fantastic grades, or they're not using scores, but I have fantastic leadership. The UCs may not even be reading your applications. I mean, they're definitely looking at them, but understand. So here are 10 terrifically important insights about dealing with these realities. The first is understand that your essays are very important. They are necessary, but not sufficient. What I mean is it's impossible to get into selective colleges without having great essays. And bad essays, we'll talk later about what makes an essay bad. They can harm you for the UCs tremendously. But great essays still may not make you likely to get in. And since UCLA pays admissions readers $2.50 per application, you can be certain, since they get 150,000 applications, you can be certain, unless these admissions readers want to make below minimum wage, they can't really read the applications. Knowing that most humans who are educated read at about 240 words per minute for nonfiction, although maybe some of the essays are better put in the fiction category, it's impossible for the readers to not either be forced to make below minimum wage or to just skim what they are reading. Bad essays could easily get you rejected, but the impact of great essays has been blunted. But you gotta have strong essays to even have a shot in this game. A second thing I think you can keep in mind to deal with these realities is understanding how GPA matters and how it doesn't. What I mean by that is avoid B's and C's. Too many B's are now almost death sentences. I have mixed feelings about even saying this because some of my favorite human beings are really rigorous teachers, really rigorous math teachers or English teachers. But frankly, more than a handful of B's can be kind of a serious problem. Some people think, then I will take a bunch of goofy online pay for an A classes to pump up my GPA. That doesn't work. First of all, most colleges do not look at the GPA as a simple number, 4.4 versus 4.2 versus 4.6, because they know many schools have a scale where a 4.9 is a really good GPA, and CCA and Westview, no one has a 4.9. That's impossible. An extraordinary GPA would be a 4.4. Universities might be cynical, but they're not stupid. They understand, like, one high school is kind of paying you in Canadian dollars in terms of your GPA and the other American dollars. They know that they can't just look at that number. They look at the transcript and they're looking to see, do you have mostly A's and did you take difficult classes? After that, it's just kind of a yes or a no. So the quest to get the highest possible GPA, because you're like, they're not looking at scores. They must value GPA. You're missing the big picture. They don't want any metric like that at all. They want issues of identity or hardship, not an identifiable metric. You're got to keep in mind, merit itself is a category that is under distress, that is under suspicion in universities. Almost everything that my clients culturally value, working hard, doing your best, that is not really a UC and an Ivy League admissions reader are going to look with different eyes at your student. In fact, my job lately has been to train people how to see with those eyes. That is one reason why my third, okay, my computer's frozen again. I'm going to tell you what my third of these 10 things to keep in mind is, and then hopefully the slide will catch up. You've got to think beyond the UC system. Okay, students tell me, I want to stay close. I want to be in California. Parents tell me they want to pay in-state tuition. Okay, but you've got to think beyond the UC system. I know you want all of those things, but you also want to go to college. You need to apply to out-of-state universities, and in your free time, organize politically to draw attention to how unhappy you are about the fact that your extremely talented, hardworking students can't find the space they deserve in their own university system. You need to apply to out-of-state universities, especially if you want to study engineering and computer science. The only way to game the UC admissions process now that it has essentially zip code quotas. I mean, that's what it means when Westview is 44% to 6.7. The only way to game it is to apply outside of the system. One piece of good news is that even though engineering and computer science programs at University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign or Purdue are incredibly selective, 3%, 4% acceptance rates, in the office, it looks like our acceptance rate for those programs with our students was more in the neighborhood of 75%. One of my students went to Purdue to visit and talk about computer engineering, and the dean of that department literally said, well, okay, you're asking me if you could change your major. Well, maybe, you know, it's pretty hard, frankly, to change your major. And then the dean said, wait a minute. Oh, you're one of these kids from one of these schools in San Diego in Southern California. You've taken 3 years of calculus. Then the dean said, oh, you'll just breeze through this. You're so far ahead of most of the kids that we get from Midwestern strong schools. Objectively, in terms of merit, 6 or 7 San Diego high schools are producing some of the strongest students, especially in STEM, of anywhere in the United States. Many of these schools offer merit scholarships because they're very excited, proud to have a student who looks kind of brilliant. Most people are aware that GPA goes up and down depending on rigor. If I ask a student at Westview or CCA how many hours a night they study, the most common answer is 3. In that quiz that I gave you, the young woman who got into UC San Diego with no activities and extremely low scores, when I asked her that question, she seemed puzzled by it. The answer was 0. She spent 0 hours studying. Her school's policy was no one should have any homework. She told me that homework was inequitable. I don't disagree that different homes have different resources, and that's quite frankly not fair. I'm not sure I agree that the solution would be then no one will do any practice or any reading or any math or any work at home. There are universities that are very, very interested in students who seem to be incredibly talented and incredibly knowledgeable. Those universities are not the UCs or the Cal States. I strongly encourage you to not think anymore in terms of reach and target and safety. I encourage you to create a new category that we should probably call merit-driven universities. Some of these merit-driven universities are in the top 10 of US News rankings for engineering or for business. There are top tier liberal arts colleges because there's someplace cold that this year on average gave my students each $160,000 in merit-driven aid and special named scholarships. One Midwestern, fairly obscure for Californians, liberal arts college has produced major network news anchors, billionaires, the CEO of Ulta Beauty. You will need to look at some ways that quality and outcomes are strong in some schools that might not be immediately on your list. In fact, number 5 is expand your list of colleges, not just to include geographic areas, but also literally expand your list. I used to tell people 10 or 15 was a pretty good number of colleges for someone who's ambitious. I would probably say now 20, maybe even 25. The Common App tops out at 20. So we're now building strategies where we will have 2 different kinds of applications because you can't, with a great app, you still can't predict where you will get in. So this year, I have so many students. We have a ton of students at Stanford and Yale this year, but the kids who got into Stanford, most of the other super top schools said no, 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 Stanford, yes. No, 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 Yale. If you don't apply to these schools, you have no chance. I would encourage you to apply to different colleges than those that would impress your family and neighbors, and instead consider some colleges that are very hard to get into, but colleges that will impress future employers and med schools and law schools. And these colleges have a very awkward name. They are liberal arts colleges. Liberal arts colleges are not necessarily politically liberal, and they don't teach art. The liberal arts college is a terrible name. It miscommunicates what they are. They are smaller, essentially kind of handmade products for education. I often tell people, I taught a class at UCLA called Intro to the Novel. It had 450 people in it. I taught it on a stage with a microphone attached to my shirt. You can't write a letter of rec for someone for med school if you have never met them. At these liberal arts colleges, at the very top, the acceptance rate to med school, if you have good grades, is north of 95% in most cases. In fact, some of them, in some years, it's literally 100%. And if you go down to the bottom, the acceptance rate at the bottom of the top tier is around 90 to 92%. At UCLA and Berkeley, the acceptance rate hovers around 50% for students who have very good grades and very good scores. One pretty snobby analogy that I might give is to think about a Swiss watch. If you're working at a fancy trading company like Jane Street or Jump Trading, and your boss is super happy with you and he wants to get you a present for the holiday. If you're offered a Rolex or an Audemars Piguet, if someone asked me this, it's a pretty crazy hypothetical. When I was 18, I would have said, oh, I want the Rolex. I don't even know what that other weird watch is. But if you worked in investment banking or you're a quant working in trading, you would know you made the wrong choice. The Audemars Piguet is worth 5 times what the Rolex is and is a handmade product. I can't get students to apply to liberal arts colleges, and I want you to consider Middlebury, a liberal arts college in Vermont, was number 9 on the Wall Street Journal's rank of what universities send people into finance in New York City. I have students even this year who refuse to apply to schools like Brown, Dartmouth, even Columbia, because they wanted Stanford or UPenn Wharton or nothing. That's not a good strategy anymore, because there are things that you may consider to be pretty unimpressive, but I want you to consider the people you're trying to impress in some cases might be your future boss. It might be a medical admissions committee, and they will look at a school like Williams or Amherst or Swarthmore or Middlebury or Haverford and not say, what the heck is that? Instead, they will say, wow, this is a very impressive student. I have a Facebook message from a student just 2 weeks ago telling me, oh, I got into Williams and I was a little disappointed, but you told me, no, Williams is an amazing place. I should share it with people. Well, I got to ask her, it's private. But she said, when I got there, I realized, okay, Mr. Hamilton was right. This will open so many doors. She ended up working in finance, and she was actually writing to say that she's been accepted to Harvard Business School. I promise you, Williams was not originally on her list. And even when she got in, she thought, huh, what's that? She knows better. It's competitive. You need to know better. You need to not write off some of those opportunities. I encourage you to consider the ideological impact of your Common App essays. This is a fancy way of saying, if you're applying for a STEM major, engineering or computer science, you can be sure that there are no STEM majors working in an admissions office. I'm not going to tell you what they make, but it is not as much as STEM majors make, eating a soggy Subway sandwich at their desk, reading 150 applications a day. No engineering or computer science major will ever take that job. You are writing for humanities majors. These are my people. This is my tribe. So you think they're going to be impressed by how you solve this problem in your machine learning tool? No, they're impressed by something else. I had a student who last year won first in the International Science and Engineering Fair for discovering something extraordinary about the Cat's Eye Nebula. He, in fact, won Young Astronomer of the Year when he unfortunately lost his summer science program opportunity because of COVID. He came to me and said, oh, what should I do? It's too late to apply to others. I said, just create something for others. That's what these readers will want to see. Without any help from me other than that suggestion, he created a summer science camp online, and it was super successful. In his acceptance letter from Stanford, they mentioned nothing about the scientific discoveries, what he had achieved. They simply said, amazing that your summer science program reached out to underrepresented and marginalized students. You have to understand the ideological viewpoint of the reader. I am in many ways an ideological translator for families who imagine that everybody must look at the world the way that they do. I promise you, in these offices, they look at it in a way that will seem a little strange. This will make sense, I hope, to most people. Take the SAT and/or ACT. When most colleges say that they're test optional, they really don't mean for you. It's, if your girlfriend in college seems upset and sullen and you say, are you okay? Is anything wrong? And she says, no. That doesn't necessarily mean that nothing is wrong. I would say it sounds like something is wrong. When colleges say, oh, no, it won't make a difference, the data doesn't suggest that. When we look at the data about who submitted scores in the last couple of years, people who submitted scores are accepted at almost double the rate. Even scores that aren't very good in the bottom 25th were still accepted at a greater rate than people who didn't submit, largely because not very good, at least you know it's not very good. The 24th percentile is not great, but if you don't submit, they don't know, you might be the 4th percentile. In other words, even fairly low scores empirically seem to be helpful for colleges. You look at the dean of admissions at Emory saying basically kids who submitted test scores had a clear advantage. If you come from a middle-class background, according to an education reporter, you have a more kind of typical profile, you probably want to submit scores. We, in the last 3 years, in these challenging years, have had more than 100 students admitted to Ivy Plus universities like Stanford and Harvard. I can't find one who was accepted without SAT and ACT. And besides, there are scholarships that are connected to these exams. Do not listen to people telling you, oh, I don't need to take this. This is where the rigor of your high school education will be demonstrated. And this is how the non-UC schools are going to evaluate out-of-state students about whom they know very little other than these objective measures. There's very strong evidence that you want to take these tests. Don't be surprised, a little bit of self-promotion. I hope you will forgive me. The Huffington Post a few years ago said that Hamilton was perhaps the best prep testing program in the country. Let us know if you want help with the SAT. We're good at it. Another tip I want you to consider is what I'm going to call the reverse snowman. Most people will say you want to have a few reaches, and then you want to have a bunch of targets, and then you want to have, your safety schools. I would reverse it. I would have a bunch of reaches if you are a very competitive applicant. If you're a competitive applicant, you just need one of these dream schools. Like an everlasting gobstopper, all you ever need is one. Yale will do it. Dartmouth will do it. MIT will be fine. You may indeed, of those 15 or 16 reach schools, may not get your particular dream school. I promise you, if you got one of those, you got everybody else's dream school. At the bottom should be merit-driven colleges. You cannot look to 5 years ago and say, Santa Cruz will be my safety. Santa Cruz is interested in equity. They're interested in representation. They are interested not in traditional notions of merit. And if you fit into some of the categories that most of my students do, frankly, not interested in you. I would remind everyone, maybe the overarching thing to consider is when you are applying to colleges, you're not a consumer. Colleges give you the impression that you're a consumer. You visit and you get this lovely tour experience. They send you emails that sound like, they're kind of hitting on you. I mean, if a human sent you this many emails, you'd probably think you were being stalked. Colleges give the impression that you're making a consumer choice, but even when you visit colleges, you're not really asking, is this the type of place I like? You are not only not a consumer, you're not even really an applicant where they're looking at just the quality of your application. When you apply to colleges, you are essentially not an applicant, but a supplicant. I mean, if you visit UPenn and you notice that they have a question that says, why do you want to come to UPenn? Or what is it about UPenn? You don't want to really tell them like, oh man, I mean, it's exactly the location I want. You want to use your visit to produce what we might call narrative reconnaissance. You want to make sure that you have a story that connects with the admissions people. So, how do you visit a college? Not like you test drive a car. You visit a college by realizing, I got to come away from this visit with a story that explains why I really get this school. Try to arrange a visit with a classroom. Try to connect with a professor. Even ask an undergrad a question that you can later talk about in your application. Once you get into college, once you are accepted, even at Yale or Harvard, now you are a consumer. Now the college will do anything to make you happy. They will fire a professor who hurt your feelings or said something that you found to be offensive. But when you're applying in this aristocratic system, you're not an applicant, you're a supplicant. Keep that in mind. I have a little bit of time to answer some questions. These are questions that people asked a year or two ago. I don't want to keep people too late. And I also want to make sure people know there are many, many good schools that would be thrilled to have strong leaders and strong students. And I encourage you to do something that in some populations, there's a history of this being a little bit dangerous. I encourage people to be a bit more politically active in engaging with the UCs. The UCs and the Cal States are meant to be your university system. Your students should have a fair chance. The notion of what is fair is really at stake, at issue here. I'm going to see if there are some questions, and if there are ones that I can answer coherently in this session, I'll try to do that. Otherwise, I will remind everyone my personal email is ch, the letter C, the letter H, at hamiltoneducation.com, and I'll do my best to answer questions. And if I think the question is of value to others, and as long as it's not personal, I'll share it in some way that everyone has access to. Someone's asking, like, what is the competitive score considering no SAT is required? Again, this person needs to understand it's not a merit-driven system. It is a system that's looking at zip codes and equity and representation. There are almost certainly quotas in place within certain schools. Someone anonymously is saying they're a UC San Diego professor. We will certainly keep them anonymous. I don't know who they are. They are saying everything you are saying is 100% accurate, and they see it every day. Yes, someone is asking if the acceptance rate going down has anything to do with people applying to more schools. Yes, it does. The acceptance rates have gone down for two reasons. They've gone down, yes, because there's more applications, without a doubt. I mean, the two things are absolutely related. It's pretty much algebra. but it also means that there's more pressure on the admissions team and they're not reading with the same care. I built a system to apply to Ivy Leagues, but Ivy Leagues have now done what the UCs have done, which is outsourced much of the reading to part-time readers. And it makes it harder for me to help my students really get in front of the right pair of eyes. If you go to Phillips Exeter or Sidwell Friends, you're being read by a full-time Harvard admissions reader. If you do not go to those schools, you're being read by a different team, quite literally. I've seen no one write about this, but it's very important. Someone is asking, can you make a list, or how do we get this list of schools that are merit focused? There's no list I'm aware of out in the world that says these are merit focused, and almost everyone would be in an uproar. Of course, we're merit focused. We look at many factors. Columbia, in announcing that they're going to get rid of the SAT and ACT, talked about how they look at many factors. First of all, there's never been in the history of the United States any university that used the SAT or ACT as the only mechanism. Not any, none, zero. But what Columbia and the UCs are really doing is getting ready for a likely Supreme Court decision, probably 6-3. The Supreme Court will decide it's unfair to admit people based on their race and ethnicity. I would argue when so many people who are non-white have such difficult stories and difficult backgrounds, but they do have, in the midst of that, an imperative to value education. And that probably is a cultural value that explains the bulk of overrepresentation in higher education. If the Supreme Court decides that, many schools, I'm afraid, will be forced to eliminate as many of the clear telltales and metrics that would create a paper trail to allow a lawsuit to go forward. So I'm not sure this is going to get better soon, although I think the UCs would not fare well if they had to, in court, go through what's called discovery, if they had to submit all of their internal communications. I think you would see someone's asking about APs. I'm not sure what question they're referring to. I would say for Ivy Leagues, AP scores are tremendously important because they are one of these objective measures and metrics that go beyond grades. For UCs, AP scores are important for a very different reason. If you get into the UCs, AP scores are important because you will get credit that will allow you to graduate either on time or graduate early. Ivy Leagues usually don't give you any credit for the APs in terms of graduating early, but then you don't normally need any special considerations to graduate in 4 years. At UCLA, it's so difficult to get the classes you need. It can be tremendously helpful to have a 3, 4, or 5 on an AP exam. For Ivies, having a 3 on an AP is not very helpful. 5s are much, much better, and a few 4s. When we're talking about the snowman, I would say schools in the middle would be schools where historically we would say that your numbers, any scores that you have, GPA, those are 50% acceptance rates. And then we will slowly discover which schools tend to be merit driven. Someone's asking about passion projects. I don't use that term. I'm not a fan of it. I will say I use a slightly different term. If you're asking, how important is it to show impact, to show that you created, you built, you made something? It's vitally important. In fact, most of the college consulting work I do around the world is helping 9th and 10th graders understand your story can't be, I'm a very good boy and very good girl who did everything I was told to do. Your story has to be, I did something no one told me to do. Or if they were very, very forthcoming and honest, they would say, Mr. Hamilton, this middle-aged white guy in San Diego, wouldn't shut up about how important it was that I not just be really good at math, but that I do good things with math. And so if you read an application of someone who got into Harvard, and near the end of it, they say, and so after many weeks of thinking and planning, I founded the Girls in STEM Circle. Some might call that a passion project. In that girl's case, the truest story would be, because Mr. Hamilton wouldn't shut up and held an emergency meeting in the fall, I finally got off my butt and did something other than be good at math. I did good things. Yes, we're going to record this, someone is asking. I'm also going to work on a little more polished version of it. Someone is asking if I know of a college process coach. I do. Given that last year, 35% of the MIT acceptances in San Diego County were our students, and a few years before that, almost a third of the Harvard acceptances in the counties of Southern California were ours. I think we're very, very experienced and very qualified. I'm spending more time, though, thinking about how to build lists, because the old wisdom you really have to throw right out the window. I want to look through these other questions. Someone's asking about private high schools. Does it have more weight in non-UC school systems? It really depends on the high school. The number of private high schools in California that have weight on the East Coast, it's few. It's not very many. Harker, Harvard, Westlake, we're almost at the end of the list. I'm going to work on a list of merit-based colleges. It's, again, tricky because all of them think they are. None of them want to suggest they're not considering merit. Honestly, we want to look at who offers merit scholarships and who has certain direct admit programs to certain very prestigious programs. Indiana University, the Kelley School of Business will admit people based on scores and grades as long as the essays are solid. Midwestern, top 10 engineering computer science programs will usually accept quite a few students, regardless of whether they are Asian American or Middle Eastern. Someone's asking about extracurriculars and the area of your major. Your extracurriculars are tremendously important if your major is what we would call impacted or pre-professional: engineering, computer science, nursing. If it's not any of those, and you're applying, for instance, to an Ivy League school, there may indeed be no relationship between your extracurriculars. I've had students who wrote about making movies and film. That student went to an Ivy League school, did not major in film, did not major in bio as his dad wanted. Instead, he ended up computer science. In fact, one future conversation might be why certain private schools, it's very likely to jump into computer science from other majors, but at the UCs, it's practically impossible. I can't say whether I'm seeing ACT or SAT results trending higher or lower. In the office, they seem, I would say I'm seeing kids coming with weaker reading and focus and concentration skills, largely from COVID. I don't know whether it's just learning loss or it's just a kind of massive kind of malaise and depression that was inflicted upon students. I'm seeing kids coming in a little less strong. I think that's a topic probably for another conversation. Someone's asking about, what about community college for 2 years and then transferring? I think it's very murky. I think that crystal ball is going to be a hard one to peer into. The governor of California has instructed UCLA to accept everyone who wishes to transfer into UCLA from community college. I think some of you can see the pragmatic issue with that problem. I, on the one hand, think that there'll be more attrition, more students dropping out of competitive UC schools because they were accepted out of equity decisions rather than merit-driven ones. But I also think I'd be really nervous about making a plan that assumed that the transfer path from community college was going to be as predictable and smooth as it maybe was a few years ago, because frankly, nothing is as smooth and predictable as it was. I am saying a safety school, someone's asking about this, would be any school where they're really, really interested in your grades and your scores and less interested in how you fit into a demographic representation. Texas is an exception. Texas is not quite like California, but Michigan is a lot like California. Texas has a system where they will admit the top certain percentage GPA wise. The UCs, again, it's a topic for another day. They can't really make that promise anymore. If you look at the UC, what's called eligibility in the local context, it has been watered down to the point where it currently says, if you're in the top 9%, we will try to make a space for you if there is space. That is the UC saying, we'll try, but no promises. I want to thank everyone. I hope I didn't step on any toes. I did maybe gore one or two sacred cows. I have many other questions here. I'm not going to get to all of them. I do beg you, please, if there's a question that I haven't answered, please send it my way. I'm really committed to doing more writing in a national venue, because I have been honored to work with kids who have difficult lives, kids who have come in recent years from Syria, kids who are this year, who are Mexican American and have very difficult family lives. And in many ways, because their families chose to live a very modest life in a very good school district, the UCs have made it harder for them to find the spot that they deserve. I won't go into some of the stories that I've had shared with me of people's journeys to this country and journeys to the middle class. Those stories are powerful. One of my concerns is that the UCs, in hoping to be more inclusive, have so many applications that they can't really read them and process them. And if they can't read them and process them responsibly, then your story isn't heard. So we got to make sure you send your story somewhere where it will be heard, it will be regarded, and it will have meaning. That's been the project the last year or two. I want to thank everyone for your time. I haven't really talked about this topic publicly ever. It's very sensitive. I hope you'll forgive me if I've offended anyone's sensibilities or said anything that you don't like. Why don't you send me a message and I'll think through some ways that maybe I need to take another look at some of these issues. But I will tell you, I've been thinking about some of these things since 1996. If you go back into the LA Times, there's a picture of students organizing civil disobedience against Prop 187 and 209, and I'm in one of those pictures. I've been thinking about this for a while. My opinions have evolved a little bit. I'm still really interested in what is fair and what provides opportunities for kids who've worked hard. Thank you very much for your time. I'm gonna wish everyone a good evening and reach out if I can be useful to you. Thank you.